The city continued its frenzied rhythm when a millionaire suffered a serious accident in the middle of the crowd. People looked on, but no one did anything until a little beggar girl approached. With eyes full of hope, she touched his cold hand and shouted, "The millionaire is alive." What happened next left everyone in shock and changed their lives forever. Subscribe for more stories and comment where you're watching this video from. The sun was setting over New York City, painting the skyscrapers with golden hues that contrasted with the elongated shadows cast over the busy streets. On the 50th floor of the most imposing building on Fifth Avenue, Richard Montgomery observed the city through the mirrored windows of his presidential suite. At 45, he had built a financial empire that made his name echo through the corridors of power. The phone rang for the third time that afternoon. It was Claire, his assistant for over a decade. "Mr. Montgomery, the board meeting is scheduled for 7 o'clock. Would you like me to postpone it again?" Richard adjusted his Italian silk tie in front of the window's reflection. "That won't be necessary, Claire. I'll be there this time." His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he headed to the meeting room. The walls were decorated with expensive works of art, each meticulously chosen to impress. Along the way, employees bowed slightly, murmuring, "Good afternoon, Mr. Montgomery," with a mixture of respect and fear. In the meeting room, 12 executives waited anxiously. The murmur ceased as soon as Richard entered. He positioned himself at the head of the table, his presence dominating the room. "Gentlemen," he began, his deep voice filling the room, "the numbers for the last quarter are impressive, but they're not enough." One of the directors, Paul Miller, dared to interrupt. "But, Mr. Montgomery, we increased profit by 47% compared to last year." Richard looked at him coldly. "And we lost 53% of growth opportunity, Miller. Mediocrity has no place in this company." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard continued his presentation, presenting even more ambitious goals for the next quarter. No one else dared to question him. After the meeting, it was already past 9 o'clock when he decided to dine at Le Noir, an exclusive restaurant on the rooftop of one of the city's most luxurious buildings. The maitre d' received him with the usual reverence, leading him to his reserved table with a view of the illuminated city. "The usual, Mr. Montgomery?" "Yes, Marcel. And bring that 82 Bordeaux." While waiting for his dinner, Richard was reviewing some emails on his latest model cell phone. That's when a particular message caught his attention. It was from his sister, Helen. "Richard, we need to talk about Dad. The situation is getting worse and you're the only one who can help." He ignored the message, as he had been doing for months. His father, August Montgomery, had lost everything in an unsuccessful investment years ago. For Richard, that was a symbol of weakness, something he swore he would never show. Dinner arrived perfectly presented, but Richard barely tasted the flavor. His mind was occupied with the next acquisitions, the next victories. For him, stopping meant failing, and failure was not an option. As he left the restaurant, the night had cooled considerably. A light drizzle, typical of New York, began to fall. That's when his eyes caught a movement in the shadows. A small figure approached timidly, barefoot despite the cold, wearing simple but clean clothes. It was a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with eyes of a deep brown that seemed to carry wisdom beyond her years. "Mister," she said in a soft voice, "could you help me with a piece of bread?" Richard observed her for a moment. Something in that look deeply disturbed him, as if those eyes could see through the armor he had built over the years. A small wooden crucifix hung from the girl's neck, swaying gently with the night breeze. "There are shelters for people like you," he responded dryly, averting his gaze and heading towards his parked Porsche. The rain intensified as Richard drove through the wet streets of New York. The windshield wipers worked frantically against the falling water, creating a hypnotic rhythm that mixed with the silence inside the car. His thoughts, against his will, kept returning to the girl with the crucifix. There was something disturbing about that encounter, something he couldn't explain. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Helen. "Richard, please. Dad is asking. For you? He needs to see you." Irritated, he threw the phone onto the passenger seat. That's when he realized he had taken the longest way home, unconsciously passing through the area where his father now lived. A simple neighborhood in Queens. The narrow and poorly lit streets were a stark contrast to his world of luxury and power. A thunderclap split the sky, and for an instant, Richard saw himself as a child again, running into his father's arms during a storm. August Montgomery was different back then, a strong, respected man who had built his own empire. Until one day, he decided to invest the family's entire fortune in an ambitious social project. "Money without purpose is empty, son," he used to say. The project failed, and with it, all of the Montgomerys' fortune. Richard braked abruptly, dispersing the unwanted memory. That's when he noticed a strange movement up ahead. A group of people was gathering in front of a small community center. Curiously, among them was the same girl who had approached him earlier. Something compelled him to stop the car. Protecting himself from the rain with his imported umbrella, he approached the place. The community center was simple but well maintained. A faded sign identified it, St. Clair's Shelter. The girl was helping an elderly lady distribute hot soups to homeless people. Her small arms could barely lift the pot, but her smile never wavered. She served each person with dignity, looking them in the eyes, exchanging kind words. "Molly has a special gift," said a voice beside him. It was the elderly lady, who now observed him with a serene smile. She arrived here 6 months ago after her family suffered a setback in life. But instead of giving in to sadness, she decided to help others who are going through difficulties. "Molly." Richard repeated the name softly, observing the girl who was now carefully serving soup to an elderly man. "Yes, she's our little missionary," continued the lady, who introduced herself as Mrs. Cecilia. "Every day she goes out to ask for help, at the restaurants in the area. Not for herself, but to get food for our community soup kitchen. The little she receives, she multiplies with faith and love." Richard felt something strange in his chest, a mixture of shame and admiration. That same girl he had coldly dismissed was there, transforming her own pain into service to others. "And her parents?" he asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. Mrs. Cecilia's smile took on a melancholic tone. Her father was a successful businessman. He invested everything he had in a project to help underprivileged children. When the project failed, he lost everything. Her mother couldn't handle the pressure and left, but Molly, she never lost faith. Richard felt his legs weaken. The story was painfully familiar. At that moment, Molly approached, carrying a steaming bowl of soup. Her eyes widened in recognition. "You came," she exclaimed with genuine joy. "I knew you would. I've been praying for it." "You prayed for me?" Richard asked, confused. "Of course, when I saw you earlier, I realized you needed help even without knowing it." The simplicity and conviction of that statement completely disarmed him. Here was a child who, even after having lost everything, managed to see beyond appearances and care for a stranger who had treated her with disdain. "Would you like some soup?" she offered, extending the bowl. "It's not much, but it was made with love." Richard looked at the simple soup, then at his Italian suit that cost more than a popular car. His entire world of luxury and power suddenly seemed empty in the face of this little girl's wealth of spirit. Richard accepted the bowl of soup with trembling hands, a gesture that surprised even himself. The familiar aroma instantly transported him to his childhood, to his mother's kitchen. It was the same smell, the same comforting warmth. "This recipe," he began, his voice faltering slightly. Mrs. Cecilia smiled. "It's an old recipe. I learned it from a very special lady many years ago. Lucy Montgomery was her name." The world seemed to spin around Richard. Lucy Montgomery, his mother. The coincidences were accumulating in a way he could no longer ignore. "Are you all right?" Molly asked, her big eyes showing genuine concern. "You look pale." Richard leaned on a nearby chair, trying to regain his balance. That's when he noticed the photographs on the wall of the community center. Among them, one in particular caught his attention: his father, August Montgomery, much younger, next to Mrs. Cecilia, in front of what appeared to be the inauguration of the center. "This place," he murmured, was my father's project. Mrs. Cecilia nodded gently. Yes, St. Clair's shelter was your father's dream, Richard. He invested everything here, believing he could make a difference. And he did. Hundreds of lives have been transformed in this place over the years. But it failed, Richard replied bitterly. We lost everything. Lost? Mrs. Cecilia questioned gently. Or gained something much greater. This place is still standing, still transforming lives. Your mother, Lucy, worked here as a volunteer until her last days. She was the one who made this soup. Richard felt the weight of 2 decades of resentment begin to dissolve. Long suppressed memories began to emerge. His mother singing while cooking for dozens of people. His father hugging children who found here their first moment of true welcome. Why didn't anyone tell me? He asked, more to himself than to others. You distanced yourself, son, a familiar voice answered from the door. It was Helen, his sister, who was observing him with teary eyes. After Mom passed away, you completely closed yourself off. You built your empire but lost connection with everything she and Dad valued most. Molly, who had been observing the scene in silence, approached Richard and held his hand. The gesture, so simple and pure, broke something inside him. Your father comes here every week, Helen continued. Even when sick, he never fails to show up. He tells stories to the children, teaches math to the teenagers. He transformed the apparent defeat into a much greater victory. Richard looked around. The place was simple, but there was an atmosphere of love and care that none of his luxurious offices ever had. On the walls, besides the photographs, there were drawings made by children, thank you posters, small testimonies of transformed lives. Molly reminds me of you as a child, Mrs. Cecilia commented softly. The same determination, the same sparkle in the eyes, but she didn't lose something that you tucked away very well, the ability to care. The girl, still holding his hand, smiled. You didn't lose it either. You just forgot for a while, but God never forgets us. That's when a commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention. A white-haired gentleman leaning on a cane was entering the community center. His walk was slow, but there was a dignity in his posture that time couldn't erase. Dad, Richard whispered, suddenly feeling like that boy who used to run into his father's arms during storms. August, Montgomery stopped at the entrance, his eyes meeting his son's. 20 years of silence and hurt hung between them, but there was also something else, a chance for a new beginning, an opportunity for healing. The silence that followed seemed to contain the weight of 2 decades. August Montgomery and his son stared at each other, while the rain outside created a curtain of sound that isolated that moment from the rest of the world. It was Molly who, with the wisdom peculiar to children, broke the tension. Your father tells wonderful stories about you, she said to Richard, still holding his hand, about how you always protected the weaker ones at school, how you shared your lunch with those who didn't have any. Richard felt his defenses begin to crumble. Those memories, long buried under layers of ambition and resentment, emerged with overwhelming force. Son, August finally said, his voice carrying the weight of years and emotion. You came back. Helen approached her father, offering physical and emotional support. Richard remained motionless, torn between the impulse to flee and the deep desire to embrace that man who, despite everything, had never ceased to be his hero. Why, Dad? The question escaped his lips, carrying 2 decades of pain. Why did you throw everything away for this place? August walked slowly to one of the tables where a group of children was doing homework. With a gentle gesture, he picked up one of the notebooks. You see this, Richard? This girl Anna learned to write here. Her mother works 3 jobs and had no one to leave her with. Without this place, she would be on the streets. He flipped through a few more pages. And that boy, over there, Charlie, was involved with dangerous people. Today he's in college studying engineering. Richard observed the children, the teenagers, the volunteers. Each face told a story of transformation. I didn't throw anything away, son, August continued. I transformed money into something much more valuable, hope. Your mother understood this immediately. She saw beyond the numbers, beyond the status. She saw the people. The mention of his mother made Richard stagger. Helen approached, holding his arm. "Richard," she said softly, "Mom never lost hope that you would come back. Until her last days, she kept newspaper clippings about your business achievements. She was proud but also worried. She used to say that you had built an empire but lived in a prison." Mrs. Cecilia approached with an old box. "Lucy left this for you. She asked me to keep it until the day you were ready to see." With trembling hands, Richard opened the box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to him, written over the years by his mother. There were also photographs, him as a small boy, helping in the community center's kitchen, as a teenager teaching math to underprivileged children, moments he had chosen to forget. "My son," Helen read one of the letters. "Every time I see your name in the newspapers, celebrating. Another $1 million acquisition, my heart tightens, not because I'm not proud of your success, but because I fear you've forgotten the most important lesson your father and I tried to teach, that a person's true value isn't in what they possess, but in what they're capable of giving of themselves." Richard felt the tears he had long repressed begin to fall. Molly, who hadn't let go of his hand at any moment, squeezed it gently. "You know, Mr. Richard," she said in her sweet voice, "sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters. That's what happened to my family. We lost our house, our car, everything, but we found something much greater here, a purpose." August approached his son, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You've built an impressive empire, Richard. But maybe it's time to build something even greater, a legacy of love." The businessman looked at his father, at his sister, at Molly, at all those people who made St. Clair's shelter a place of hope. His heart, long closed in an armor of numbers and successes, began to open to a wealth that no bank account could measure. The next morning, Richard woke up in his luxurious penthouse in Manhattan, but something had changed. The silence that before seemed natural to him now weighed like lead. The white and aseptic walls, decorated with extremely expensive works of art, seemed to scream an absence he had never noticed before. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. Claire, his assistant, was desperately trying to get in touch. There was an important meeting with foreign investors scheduled for that morning, but for the first time in years, Richard couldn't concentrate on the numbers. He picked up the box that Mrs. Cecilia had given him again. Among his mother's letters, he found an old diary. The yellowed pages contained notes about each child who passed through the community center. Lucy Montgomery kept a record of their dreams, their difficulties, their small victories. Mary Jane, 12 years old, he read aloud, dreams of becoming a doctor. Today she got top marks in science. Her smile lit up the whole room. Next to it was a faded photograph of a girl proudly holding a test paper. Turning the pages, he found more stories, more dreams, more transformed lives, and in each note, he perceived the love and dedication his mother invested in that work. The phone rang again. It was Helen. "Richard, Dad isn't well. He spent the whole night talking about you, about how happy he was to have seen you, but the emotion was too strong. I'm on my way there," he replied without hesitation. On the way to the hospital, Richard passed by the community center. Even at that early hour, the place was already bustling. Molly was sweeping the sidewalk, humming a gospel song. When she saw him, her face lit up. "Mr. Richard, I knew you'd come back." "How do you always have such certainty about things, Molly?" The girl smiled, leaning on the broom. "It's not me who's certain. It's God who takes care of everything. You know, last night after you left, I prayed a lot for your father. He's such a good man. He teaches us so much." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "You pray for everyone, don't you?" "Of course. Every person who passes through here is special. Mrs. Cecilia says we're all God's children, so we're one big family. And family takes care of each other, right?" Those simple words hit Richard like lightning. Family. How long had it been since he allowed himself to feel part of one? In his corporate world, relationships were always strategic, self-interested. "Molly," he hesitated for a moment, "would you like to come with me to visit my father in the hospital? I think he'd be happy to see you." The girl's eyes sparkled. But then she looked at the broom in her hands. "I need to finish my chores first. Mrs. Cecilia always says that responsibility is a form of love." Richard couldn't help but smile. "Can I help? I confess it's been a long time since I swept a sidewalk, but I think I still remember how to do it." The scene that followed was surreal. Richard Montgomery, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country in his Italian suit, sweeping a sidewalk alongside a street girl. Employees passing by to work in neighboring businesses couldn't believe what they were seeing. As they swept, Molly told him about the other residents of the center, about their dreams and difficulties. She spoke of each one as if they were precious treasures, worthy of all care and attention. "You know, Mr. Richard," she said as they put away the brooms, "sometimes people think that helping others means losing something, but actually we only gain. We gain friends, we gain smiles, we gain stories, and that's worth more than all the money in the world." Richard looked at his hands, now with small calluses from the broom handle. Instead of feeling diminished by the manual labor, he felt strangely fulfilled. It was a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time, the simple satisfaction of doing something useful, something that benefited others besides himself. The private hospital where August was admitted was one of the most luxurious in New York. Richard had insisted on transferring him there, even against his father's initial protests, who preferred the public hospital where he had always been treated. As he entered the room with Molly, he found Helen sitting beside the bed, reading one of their mother's old diaries to their father. August, though weakened, smiled when he saw the unlikely pair entering. "Look who came to visit you, Grandpa August," Molly exclaimed, running to hug him carefully. Helen looked at Richard in surprise. "Grandpa?" "Molly has adopted everyone at the community center as family," Richard explained, a slight smile on his lips. "And apparently I'm now included in that package." "And isn't that what we are?" the girl asked simply. "Family isn't just who has the same blood, it's who has the same love in their heart." August held Molly's small hand. "You're very wise, little one. You remind me so much of Lucy. She also had this gift of seeing the best in people." Richard approached his father's bed. His hands, which hours earlier had held a broom for the first time in decades, now trembled slightly. "Dad," he began, his voice choked, "forgive me. For all this lost time, for all the resentment I held." "There's nothing to forgive, son," August gently interrupted. "Everyone has their own time to understand certain truths. Your mother always knew this day would come. That's why she kept all those letters." Helen wiped away a tear. "She never lost faith in you, Richard. Even when you completely distanced yourself, she said that one day your heart would come home." "And it did," Molly added cheerfully. "I knew from the moment I saw you in front of the restaurant. Your eyes were sad, but there was a special light in them." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, holding his father's other hand. "You know, Dad, I spent years building an empire, thinking I was proving something, that I was showing that your failure wouldn't define me. But now I realize that the only one who failed was me. I failed to see what really mattered." "It's never too late to start over, son," August replied, his voice weak but full of affection. "Your mother and I always knew you had a huge heart. You just needed to rediscover it." At that moment, Claire, Richard's assistant, appeared at the door of the room, visibly agitated. "Mr. Montgomery, the investors have been waiting for over an hour. It's the most important meeting of the year. You can't—" "Claire," Richard interrupted her with a calmness that surprised everyone. "Cancel the meeting. In fact, cancel all my appointments for this week." "But sir, the merger with the American group can wait. There are more important things that need my attention now." Claire looked at her boss as if he had been replaced by an imposter. In 20 years of work, she had never seen him cancel an important meeting, much less a whole week of appointments. "Richard," Helen intervened, concerned, "are you sure?" "Your work—" "My work waited 20 years to have a greater purpose," he replied with conviction. "I think it can wait a few more days." Molly, who had been observing everything attentively, smiled. "You know what we do at the center when someone is sad or sick? We sing. Can I sing a song for you, Grandpa August?" The old man nodded, moved. Molly's crystal-clear voice filled the room with an old church song. the same one Lucy used to sing while cooking at the community center. The following days brought changes that no one could have predicted. Richard began dividing his time between the hospital, where his father was gradually recovering, and the community center. Every morning before going to the office, he stopped at St. Clair's shelter to have breakfast with the residents. On one of these mornings, while observing Molly, helping other children with their homework, an idea began to form in his mind. He called Mrs. Cecilia for a private conversation. "The center needs renovations," he commented, observing the peeling walls and the ceiling that showed some leaks. Mrs. Cecilia sighed. "Yes, but we maintain it as best we can. The donations barely cover food and basic costs." "What if we could do more than just renovate?" Richard asked, his eyes shining with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in a long time. "What if we could expand? Create proper classrooms, a space for vocational courses, a library?" The lady looked at him in surprise. "Richard, that would be wonderful, but it wouldn't be just charity," he continued, years of business experience shaping his plan. "It would be an investment in the future. We could create a financial education program, career guidance, a small business incubator, not just giving the fish, but teaching how to fish." As he spoke, Richard realized he was using his business talents not to accumulate more wealth, but to multiply opportunities. It was as if he had finally found a purpose for all the skills he had developed over the years. "Your father tried something similar," Mrs. Cecilia gently reminded him. "Yes, but now it's different," Richard smiled. "Now, it's not just one man trying to do everything alone. We can create a support network, involve companies, volunteer professionals, transform the center into a model of sustainable social development." At that moment, Molly approached, carrying some books. "Mr. Richard, can you help me with math? There are some difficult problems here." Richard looked at the girl's math exercises, remembering how his father used to help him with homework when he was a child. "Of course, Molly. You know, math can be very fun when we understand that each number tells a story." While explaining the operations to Molly, other children began to approach, curious. Soon, Richard found himself surrounded by a small group eager to learn. It was a completely different feeling from the board meetings he was used to. "You could teach classes here," suggested one of the boys. "My mom always says she needs to learn math better to manage her small store." The suggestion made Richard realize something important. The knowledge he had accumulated over the years didn't need to serve only to make money. It could be a tool for social transformation. "You know what?" he said, looking at the children and then at Mrs. Cecilia. "I think I've found my new vocation." At the end of that afternoon, Helen stopped by the center to pick up her brother for another visit to their father at the hospital. She found him sitting on the floor surrounded by children using paper clips and candies to teach basic accounting concepts. "I never thought I'd see this scene," she commented, moved. "Neither did I," Richard replied, smiling. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm doing something that really matters." On the way to the hospital, Richard shared his plans with his sister. Helen listened attentively, recognizing in her brother the same sparkle in his eyes that their father had when he talked about his dreams of social transformation. The news spread quickly through the corporate world. Richard Montgomery, the ruthless CEO of the Montgomery Group, was revolutionizing his company. The headlines of the economic newspapers couldn't believe the transformation that was happening. On a particularly busy morning, Richard called an extraordinary board meeting. The room was packed with anxious and curious executives about what was to come. Claire, his faithful assistant, observed with a mixture of concern and admiration the changes in her boss. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his voice firm but different from the authoritarian tone of before. "For years, we've built an empire based only on numbers. Today, I propose something different. Let's build a legacy." The slides began to appear on the big screen, showing the project to transform St. Clair's shelter into an integrated social development center. The plans included modern classrooms, computer labs, space for vocational courses, and even a small business incubator. "But this is madness," exclaimed one of the directors. "Are we going to throw money away on social projects?" Richard smiled, remembering how he thought the same way just a few days ago. "No, we're going to invest in people. Every dollar applied to this project will return multiplied in developed talents, transformed lives, and yes, even in financial results." He went on to explain how the project would be self-sustainable, with strategic partnerships, microcredit programs, and a mentoring system that would involve executives from the company itself. "Imagine," he continued, "how many talents we're losing due to lack of opportunities. How many future entrepreneurs, engineers, doctors are hidden in the streets of our city, waiting for just one chance." At the back of the room, Helen smiled, proud. Beside her, to everyone's surprise, was Molly, whom Richard had specially invited for that moment. "Allow me to introduce," he said, calling the girl to the front, "our newest social project consultant." Molly, wearing a simple but elegant dress that Helen had helped her choose, walked timidly to Richard. Her eyes shone with the same determination as always. "Hi," she said, her sweet voice echoing in the high-tech meeting room. "I'm Molly, and I want to tell you how a little love can change everything." For almost half an hour, the girl shared her experiences at the community center. She talked about how each person who arrived desperate found not only shelter, but hope. She told stories of transformation, of overcoming, of new beginnings. The executives, accustomed to spreadsheets and graphs, found themselves moved by this different report based on real stories and true feelings. "And you know what's most incredible?" Molly concluded. "All this happens with so little. Imagine what we could do with more resources, with more people believing." Richard resumed speaking, now with a different sparkle in his eyes. "Our company has always been known for transforming numbers into profit. Now we're going to transform profit into social transformation. I'm not asking for the board's permission. I'm communicating a new direction. Whoever wants to be part of this revolution is invited to stay. Whoever doesn't believe in this vision is free to follow another path." The silence that followed was broken by Claire, who surprised everyone by standing up from her chair. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice choked, "I've worked with you for 20 years. I've never felt so proud to be part of this company as I do today." One by one, the executives began to speak up, some with immediate enthusiasm, others with caution, but all intrigued by this new vision of business that united purpose and prosperity. 6. Months passed since that transformative meeting. St. Clair's shelter was unrecognizable. The once peeling walls now displayed colorful murals made by the residents themselves. The classrooms were equipped with computers and digital whiteboards, and the cafeteria had been expanded to serve more meals. On a Saturday afternoon, while supervising the installation of the new library, Richard found an old photo album among the donation boxes. In the yellowed pages, he recognized his mother, young and smiling, serving soup to a line of people. Next to her, a small girl helped distribute bread. "That was me," said Mrs. Cecilia, approaching silently. "Your mother found me on the streets, just as you found Molly. The circle completes itself, doesn't it?" Richard felt a lump in his throat. "That's why you knew the soup recipe so well." "Yes, Lucy taught me more than recipes. She taught me the value of compassion, and now you're continuing that legacy in a way that not even she could have imagined." In the courtyard, now fully renovated, dozens of people participated in professional training classes. Partner businessmen of the project offered workshops, Montgomery Group executives acted as mentors, and even some of the former homeless people were already starting their own small businesses. August recovered. Hans Stronger personally coordinated the financial education program. His life experience, both the successes and the apparent failures, served as a valuable lesson for everyone. "Son," he called Richard, who was observing the activities from the window of his new office at the community center. "There's someone here who wants to talk to you." It was a middle-aged woman holding a small package. Her eyes were teary. "Mr. Montgomery," she began timidly, "I came to thank you. Thanks to the microcredit program and the entrepreneurship classes, I managed To open my small bakery. This is the first cake I sold. Richard received the package, moved. You're the one giving us a gift, Mrs. Mary Jane, she completed. Many years ago, your mother helped me when I was just a girl dreaming of studying. She recorded my dream of becoming a doctor in her diary. But life took a different turn. Today, my daughter is in her first year of medical school, thanks to the Montgomery Institute scholarship. It clicked. It was the same Mary Jane from his mother's notes, the one who had gotten top marks in science. The dream hadn't come true, ever her, but it was coming true through her daughter. Helen, who now directed the social responsibility sector of the Montgomery Group, entered the room with exciting news. Richard, you won't believe it. The St. Clair model is being replicated. In 5 other cities, businessmen who used to think only about profit are realizing that it's possible to make a difference without giving up financial success. And this is just the beginning, Richard replied, looking out the window at the courtyard full of life. Every person who passes through here takes with them a seed of transformation. Molly, who now officially lived at the center with other children, coordinated a children's choir. Their voices filled the air with songs of hope, the same ones Lucy used to sing. You know what's most incredible? The girl commented during a break from rehearsals. Before, I thought I needed a family. Now I realize I've gained hundreds of them. A year had passed since that rainy night when Richard met Molly at the restaurant door. The St. Clair Social Development Center, as it was now called, was preparing for its first graduation. 50 students from the vocational courses would receive their certificates, many of them already employed or with their own businesses up and running. The newly built auditorium was packed. In the front row, August Montgomery sat between Helen and Molly, his eyes shining with pride. Mrs. Cecilia, always discreet, observed everything from a corner, her hands intertwined in a silent prayer of gratitude. Richard took the stage to give his speech. He wore a simple suit, very different from the expensive Italian ensembles he used to wear. His face, once always tense and serious, now displayed a serenity that was contagious to everyone. A year ago, he began, I thought I knew everything. About success. I had built an empire, conquered markets, accumulated fortunes, but I was completely wrong about the true meaning of wealth. His words echoed through the auditorium, while images from the past year were projected on the screen behind him. Before and after photos of the center, stories of overcoming, smiles of hope. My parents tried to teach me this from an early age, but I needed to get lost to find my way back, and it was a little girl with a crucifix around her neck and faith in her heart who showed me that the greatest treasures cannot be kept in safes. Molly smiled, holding August's hand, who discreetly wiped away a tear. Today, Richard continued, we're not just celebrating the graduation of 50 students, we're celebrating the birth of 50 new dreams, 50 new possibilities, 50 new beginnings, and each of you carries with you the responsibility to multiply this transformation. Helen stood up, joining her brother on the stage. Together, they unveiled a commemorative plaque, Lucy Montgomery Institute, transforming lives through love and education. Our mother, Helen spoke, her voice choked with emotion, always said that love is the only investment that never fails. Today we see the living proof of that. The graduates, one by one, received their certificates. Each story was unique. The former homeless man who was now an IT technician, the single mother who had become a chef, the young man who had exchanged the streets for a future in engineering. At the end of the ceremony, Molly surprised everyone by going up on stage. With her sweet voice, but now more mature, she began to sing the same song she had sung in the hospital a year ago. The choir she directed joined her, filling the auditorium with a melody that spoke of hope and new beginnings. Richard observed everything, his heart overflowing with a happiness that no business success had ever provided him. His empire hadn't diminished. On the contrary, it had grown in ways he had never imagined possible. But now it was an empire with purpose, measuring its success not just in numbers, but in transformed lives. August approached his son, leaning on his cane. Your mother would be so proud, son. You haven't just continued our work, you've expanded it beyond our wildest dreams. We're a very big family now, aren't we? Molly commented, joining them with her luminous smile. Richard hugged them both, while observing the crowd that celebrated not just a graduation, but the rebirth of an entire community. The ruthless businessman he had been had given way to a man who had finally understood the true meaning of success. "Yes, Molly," he answered, his heart at peace. "We're a huge family, and that makes us the richest people in the world." The sun was setting over New York, painting the sky with golden hues. But now, unlike a year ago, Richard wasn't observing the city from the top of his glass tower. He was among the people, part of something much bigger than himself. He had finally found his true place in the world, not at the top of a financial empire, but in the heart of a community that grew and strengthened every day.